everybody, welcome to the Main Street Celebration Bench Pillow Along. We've already done week one, which was the launch. We went over all of our fabrics, embellishments, and threads. Today we're going to work on our first two blocks for week two, the welcome and the fire station blocks. I will be adding background quilting to this. We'll talk about that when we get over to the machine. All of my fabric is cut and prepped. If you're going to do background quilting, you look in the instructions for the final trim size of your block. For example, here's your fire station block. The final trim size is 6.5 by 8.5. You want to cut your batting 7.5 by 9.5. The welcome block is 4.5 by 8.5. Cut your batting 5.5 by 9.5. I did show this in week one, but just in case you need to see it again, these are the colors that were used for Main Street Celebration. As we work through the colors, I'll call off the glide color name, and then I'll hold up my color and show you my color. I'm working with Floriani threads and Sim threads for this project. I have all my threads in my leather snap tray with the Creativity Blooms design. This is a free design, and I have a video on how to embroider on a leather snap tray. I'll link that for you below. For your stabilizer, you'll want to use Kimberbell's light mesh cutaway or something similar. I have this HBI no show mesh. I'm going to get my stabilizer loaded. We'll head over to the machine and I'll show you how we're going to add background quilting to these blocks. I'm on a Baby Lock Meridian. I've got my files on USB. Before I forget, these are the needles that I'll be using today. They're the Schmetz Super Non-Stick 8012 needles. They've been really good for these Kimberbell projects that have a lot of applique and stitching, going over stitching, going over stitching. Really like these. Got my trusty folding metal book stand, home sewn Needleminder. I'll have information about that below. Let's talk about how we add background quilting to this. This is an older bench pillow and it did not come with a quilting bundle. What I did was I brought up each of the blocks we're going to work on today on my embroidery machine, and I looked at their sizes. What was the field size? The welcome block was 7.91 by 4. The fire station 7.91 by 561. I knew for background quilting I wanted to use KDQ 407 Stars 11. That was part of the Star Spangled Beauty quilting bundle. I pulled that up, the block by block files, not the clear blue tiles files. 7.91 by 4. It's essentially 8 by 4. There's an 8 by 4 or 4 by 8 quilting file. This quilting is non-directional, so I don't have to worry about horizontal or vertical. All I'm looking at is the size. For the fire station, 7.91, that rounds up to 8. 5.6, I would round that up to 6. There's a 6 by 8 quilting file. We're going to load the quilting file and then load the embroidery file. You'll see that they're not an exact match, but it's going to look good, and I like the idea of doing the background quilting, then putting all of our applique and embroidery on top of it versus finishing the bench pillow and trying to figure out how to embroider it without ruining everything. So we're doing background quilting today. Let's start with the welcome block. I've got everything on USB. The first thing I need to do is load my quilting file. I put everything in my Main Street Celebration bench pillow folder. You'll see all the blocks here, and down here are the two quilting files that I put in. And you'll notice this says 6 by 10 and this says 6 by 10. They're referencing a 6 by 10 hoop. If you have a 5 by 7 hoop and need to do double hooping, there are instructions included, but I will not be doing the double hooping for my videos. We're starting with the welcome block, which is the skinny block. So we're going to load the 4 by 8 background quilting. That's one of my birds. I'll put his picture on the screen. Here's my background quilting, and then we're going to add the welcome block on top. Here's our welcome block with the bike and the tree and the fireworks. My machine centers the block over the background quilting. You can see that some of the lines don't exactly line up because the files are a little bit of a different size. If you want, you can hit edit, move. You can move things and see if it lines up any better. That looks slightly better, but it's pretty much centered. I think I moved it one click. Let's go ahead and save that to our machine in case anything happens during our stitch out. Hi everybody. One thing I forgot to look at was where the embroidery block sat on the background quilting in relation to the seam allowance at the bottom of the block. When we get to the end and we do our trimming, I have to slightly adjust my trimming to make sure that the bottom of my block will stitch in to the seam allowance so it doesn't look like it's floating on top of the border. If you're stitching along with me, you can make that adjustment now. Line up the bottom of your embroidery block with the bottom of your quilting. Make sure you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, you can go to the end of the video, watch the part about trimming, and then come back and adjust your block. Honestly, it was so slight that I'm going to leave all of my blocks centered as we go forward and make the adjustment when I trim. It's very slight. When you look at your screen, check up top. I've added that background quilting, 8.5 by 4.5. I don't have a 6x10 hoop, but if I had one, I can no longer use a 6x10 hoop because I added the background quilting. I have to use a larger hoop. I'm using my 8x12 hoop today. We're going to start with our background quilting. This is my background fabric. I'm adding a thread color. I'm going to use this color for my background quilting. It closely matches navy on the Glide color card. I want it to blend into the background fabric and not stand out. Since this is the first video where we're working on blocks for this project, I'm going to step through the background quilting for this block only. Going forward, I'll go ahead and do the background quilting off camera, since every time you do background quilting, it's the same. Let's stitch out our batting placement line. Grab your batting, you're going to cover that placement line. This is plenty big enough. It looks like I might have cut mine a little bit larger than needed. I think instead of looking at the trim size, I looked at the fabric size. That's exactly what I did. I cut my batting before thinking about the background quilting, so throughout the series of videos, my batting is going to be really big. If you cut it according to the instructions I give at the beginning of this video, your batting will be cut the correct size. I'd rather have extra than not enough. What I can do instead of centering it, I can slide it like that, and then I'll have some extra on the sides, and I'll be able to trim that off and use that for other smaller projects. Let's go ahead, add some tape, and stitch the batting tack down. We want to trim away everything outside of the tack down line. Here's what I trimmed off. These are perfect for skinny Kimberbell borders. Let's stitch out that fabric placement line. We've got our fabric placement line. Fabric I've cut per the instructions. If it said to add fusible, I added fusible. Let's go ahead and tape that in place. We're going to stitch the fabric tack down line. The fabric is tacked down. We can stitch our background quilting. The background quilting is done. We're ready to start on our block. Let's go over and look at the first thing that's showing up on our screen. The first thing that they show for stitching out this block is this little tick mark. And if you look at your instructions on page 12, here's the tick mark. This is what you would use if you did not do background quilting. This is here to help line up everything. We don't need that because we're doing background quilting. I need to skip over this. When you hit my needle minus plus, you can go forward or backwards by numbers or use the double arrows and that will move it a whole step. I want to go forward a whole step because I don't need this tick mark. The next step we have is this fabric tack down box. Again, we don't need that because we just did background quilting. If you're not doing background quilting, you would use that tick mark, line up your fabric, and stitch this tack down. We don't need that. Let's go through that. Now we're ready. We're going to start with our tree trunk. Now comes the fun part because throughout this whole project, this is how the threads are listed. Looking at this, you can tell there's a brown. The brown that's called for is caramel. This is the color I picked to match. This is what they use to stitch out the tree trunk. If you're pulling your own threads, pick a color for the tree trunk that you like. I'm going to put this on the machine and we'll stitch out that tree trunk. This looks great. It's stitched out really nice. The next thing we're going to stitch out are the leaves placement line. There's two greens that are used for this project. The darker green is pictured in the instructions. For me, that's the color that I've converted from aloe. So if you're using Glide, you would use Glide aloe. I'm going to use this color. This is a sim thread. I'm going to put this on and we're going to stitch the placement lines for our leaves. Those little leaves have stitched out. You can see we're going to have quite a bit of trimming. Something it does show in the instructions is after it's tacked down, it shows trimming the felt up the middle to make it easier to trim on either side. If you do that, I'd be really careful of this stitching. We're going to cover all those little lines with our felt. Make sure they're covered. Kind of blends into the background for me with the fabric that I'm using. We're going to tape this into place, and then we're going to stitch the tack down lines. All those little leaves now are going to get tacked down. All the tack down lines have stitched. We need to trim away everything outside of those tack down lines. There's no decorative stitching, so if you want your tree to look really pretty and nice and neat, spend some extra time doing that. If you're not as picky, trim it as fast as you want. Your tree will look fuzzy because it's felt. I've got all the little leaves trimmed. The snips were great for that. It went faster than I thought. The next thing we're going to stitch out are the bicycle tires. It's in black. Apparently I forgot to add black to my thread list. Hopefully everybody has black thread. I have a Floriani black. I'm going to put that on my machine. We're going to stitch out the bicycle tires. We've got the tires stitched out. We're going to switch to the color Sterling and stitch out the spoke details. The next thing we're going to stitch out is the bike frame. You can make that any color you want. They show it in one of the yellows. I have two yellows. One is kind of yellow and one's a more orangey yellow. I'm going to use this yellow. This is a sim thread. This is SO24. This is equivalent to the Glide Color Buttercup. I'm going to put that on my machine and stitch out the bike frame. And later in the block, we're going to stitch some fireworks. They show that in the same color yellow. I'll be using this for that as well. The next thing we're going to stitch out is the bike seat and the handles. It's in one of the reds. There's two reds. There's a darker red and a lighter red. I'm going to go with my darker red for this, and we're also going to use the same color for rocket details and fireworks. This is the color I pulled to match Glide Candy Apple. I'm going to go ahead and use that for the bike seat and handlebars, and a little further in the block for the rocket fuse and when we work with the glitter. This more closely matches the glitter vinyl that's in the embellishment kit. Going to switch back to Sterling, and we're going to stitch out the bike pedal and basket detail. I'm going to switch back to the red that I used here. We're going to stitch out the rocket fuse detail, and then looking forward in my instructions after that is the rocket spark detail, which is going to be in white, and apparently I forgot to add white to the thread list. I left off black and white. I think everybody probably has black and white. Sorry about that. I'll go ahead and run these two steps together. So I'll stitch the rocket fuse detail in red, and then I'll put the white thread on my machine and stitch out the rocket spark detail. That's really cute. We're going to switch back to the red. We're going to stitch out the rocket body placement line. If you're working with the embellishment kit, they do have this red glitter vinyl in there. If you've got your own red glitter vinyl, that'll work too. The glitter vinyl does have plastic on it. You have to peel away the plastic first. We want to cover the placement line, add some tape, and we'll stitch the tack down. There is no decorative stitching with the vinyl, and there's going to be another piece of vinyl, so we'll heat set those together. Right now we're just going to tack this down and trim. I've got that trimmed. I'm going to put the white thread back on my machine. We're going to stitch out the rocket tip placement line. There's white glitter vinyl for that. We'll place that over the placement line, tape it, tack it down, and trim exactly like we just did. I'll go ahead and run that all together. That's trimmed. You can heat set this now or heat set it at the end. I'm going to finish the block and then I'll heat set it. To heat set the glitter vinyl, you want to cover it with a pressing cloth and press it with a warm iron, not a hot iron. Just gently put your iron on there. I usually count to 10 or so, and that helps heat set that vinyl. Leave your white thread on your machine. We're going to stitch out the white star and firework explosions detail. I'm going to switch to the red that I picked for the bicycle seat and handles and that I used up here with the rocket. We're going to stitch out the red stars and firework explosions detail. Going to switch to this color yellow. This is the one I used for the bicycle. We're going to stitch out the yellow fireworks explosion detail. If you have a nice gold thread, you could also stitch this in a gold. If you've got a gold metallic that works well with your machine, that would be kind of fun. The next thing we're going to stitch out are the eyelets for the fairy lights. I'm going to use the same dark blue, this is equivalent to navy, that I used for the background quilting. I did order crystals instead, but I want to stitch out the eyelets because that'll give me a nice little round spot where I can add the glue and then glue down the crystals. Let's go ahead and stitch out those eyelets. This block is done. Let's go on to our next block. This is a different size background quilting and a different size block. This looks like it's pretty much lined up right here along the bottom. Let's go ahead and hit embroidery. I'm going to save that to my machine. And I'm going to do the background quilting off camera. There's also the same thing here with this little line in the box. We're going to move through that. So I'm going to do the background quilting, skip that, and then we'll pick up right here with stitching the inner building placement line. Background quilting is stitched out. I moved through those two steps that we don't need. We're going to stitch out the inner building placement line. It calls for one of the blues. I'm going to go ahead and stick with this dark navy. I've got my inner building fabric. I need to cover the placement line. It's right there. I'm going to add a piece of tape to hold that in place. Then we're going to tack it down and trim everything outside the tack down line. The next thing we're going to stitch out is the inner building decorative outline. It's only going to stitch here. We're going to have other stuff going on around the building. I'm going to switch to bright blue. There's two blues for this project. There's a bright blue and there's an azure blue. I did try to match these to the Glide color card. I think this blue is going to look better for the inner decorative outline. I don't want to use the navy because you can see it kind of blends in. It's really hard to see. I'm going to put this on my machine. We'll stitch out the inner building decorative outline. You can definitely see that. For the next several steps, we're placing and tacking down fabric. They have everything as a neutral thread color. For my neutral color, instead of something like white or beige, I'm going to go back to this dark blue, navy-ish color since that's my background fabric. I'm going to put this on my machine and we're going to stitch out the building placement line. Pull this towards me because I can see it. That really does blend in. It's right here. I'm going to place our building fabric. Make sure I cover that placement line. Plenty of fabric. I did cut per instructions. They're pretty generous with the fabric on this one. We're going to stitch the building tack down and then trim away everything that's outside of the tack down line. Once you've got that trimmed, we're going to stitch out the foundation placement lines. Going to place the foundation fabric, stitch the tack down, and trim. One thing I'm doing as I'm trimming these things away, like here for the building, I've got this piece. I saved this. This has fusible on the back. If you're working on the home sewn projects or other Kimberbell projects, sometimes you need a little scrap of fabric with fusible, so save your little cutoffs. Let's stitch the tack down and then trim. Next, we're going to stitch out the garage door placement line. Grab your garage door fabric. It's a white on white. Double check, make sure you've got the right side up. Going to place that, tape it, stitch the tack down, and trim. We're going to stitch out the floor division placement line. You want to place your floor division fabric. It's the same as this fabric here. Go ahead and place it to cover the line, tack it down, and trim. Next, we're going to stitch out the windows placement lines. Go ahead and place your windows fabric. We want to cover the placement lines. I've got my tape up there. We'll tack it down and trim. I've Got the windows trimmed. We're going to switch to black and we're going to stitch out the placement line for the tires. Oh my goodness, can you see how small those tires are? They're itty bitty. I think that might be 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch. They're tiny. This is the piece of leather they have you cut. If you've got a tiny scrap of embroidery leather, you'll be able to do this. I don't want to put it like that and waste the whole piece of leather. I'm going to put it like that, and then I'll cut the little pieces out and I'll have plenty left over. Actually, I may turn it this way. Yep, let's turn it that way. That'll be easier. Then I can actually center it. I don't have to worry I'm going to miss any of the little tires. Add the tape, add some tape at the bottom, stitch the tack down and trim. There's no decorative stitching on the tires. See how tiny those are? Really tiny. It says to switch to a neutral thread. We're going to stitch out the placement line for the fire truck. I'm just going to stitch it out in black. It'll be fine. Let's stitch out that placement line. Got my fire truck fabric. I want to make sure I cover the placement line. Got my tape at the top. We'll stitch the tack down and then trim. We're going to switch to sterling and stitch out the clock post scroll work detail. Leave the color sterling on your machine. We're going to stitch out the placement line for the clock post. The clock post uses this nice silver embroidery leather. We want to tape that into place. You don't want that shifting around, so make sure you add tape. I'd say at least at the top and the bottom. It just shows it at the top in the instructions. I would also tape the bottom. You don't want this moving. Then we're going to stitch the tack down. It's so shiny. We're going to trim away everything outside of the stitch lines. Don't trim this away. You want to leave that circle there, so just everything that's on the outside. Definitely save that. You might be able to use that for something else. Next, we're going to stitch out the clock face placement line. The clock face is in navy embroidery leather. I am going to go ahead and center that. Seems cut a little large, but not so much that I want to worry about how I place it. So I'm going to center it, tape it, stitch the tack down, and then trim. I've got that trimmed. It has us switching to white to stitch out the clock hands details. I'm going to try stitching it with the sterling and see if it shows up. I like the way that this color looks on the embroidery leather. So I'm going to leave this on my machine and stitch out the hands. I like the way that looks. You can stitch it in white if you like, but I like the way it looks in the sterling, which matches the detail going around the clock face. We're going to switch to black and stitch out the garage door detail. We're going to switch back to sterling and we're going to stitch out the foundation satin outline. Next, we're going to stitch out the building satin outline. I've got the candy apple and desire. I think I like the way the candy apple looks better. I'm going to put that on my machine and stitch out the building satin outline. If you're working with your own fabrics, you can coordinate to your building. Once the red satin outline is stitched, we're going to switch back to sterling and we're going to stitch out the fire station sign and floor division satin outline. It says to switch to black for the flagpole detail. When I think of a flagpole, I actually think of silver and metal. I'm going to leave the sterling on. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the flagpole in the sterling. I'm glad I didn't stitch that in black. I don't think it would have shown up as well on this fabric. We're going to switch to the brown color. I believe it's camel. I have this color. It's the same color I used for the tree. And we're going to stitch out the roof satin detail. Going to switch to the color white and stitch out the placement line for the bricks. We have the embroidery leather for the bricks. In case I haven't mentioned it, embroidery leather is not an animal product. It's a PVC synthetic product. I'm going to go ahead and cover those bricks. I'm going to tape it across the top and the bottom and then stitch out the tack down line and trim. We're going to have a nice big piece left over in the center here. These are all trimmed. There's no decorative stitching. We're going to stitch out the window satin outline. It's in the lighter color blue. The glide name is Azure. I'm going to go ahead and use this color. If you're using the fabrics that it calls for, it does have this nice blue polka dot. Coordinates very well with that thread. If you've got a different fabric and you don't want to use a bright blue, you could use a darker blue that blends with the background or any color that you like. Going to switch back to the color Sterling and stitch out the window ledge fills. After the window ledges have stitched out, there's clear vinyl in the embellishment kit. You can put down the vinyl, it's a little tight, over the windows, tape it, stitch the tack down and trim, and it's a raw edge finish. I'm not going to use the vinyl. I know I'm going to have little pokey edges of vinyl, so I'm going to actually opt to skip the clear vinyl on this. I'll set this on my embellishment pile. I'm going to go forward to the next step. The next things we're going to stitch out are in one of the colors of red, the Fire Truck Light Fill, the Fire Truck Satin Outline, and the Fire Truck Panel Fill. I'm looking at the two reds I picked. The more I look at this, the more I think this is just way too orange. There's too much orange in it. So I'm going to change this red, and I want a red that's lighter than this, but more red, if that makes sense. I've got this color. So I'm going to switch to this red. I'm going to use this red in place of where it calls for Desire. And honestly, it's hard to tell because they don't list the color names. They're just little squares of color. So pick a red that you like. I'm going to go with this red. It's the lighter of the two reds that I have. And I'm going to stitch out the next three steps. I'll go ahead and run them all together. So we're going to stitch the Fire Truck Light Fill, Fire Truck Satin Outline, and Fire Truck Panel Fill. Switch back to Sterling, and we're going to stitch out the Fire Truck side mirrors, grille, and bumper details. I'm going to switch to this color. This is what I have for glides, a Jubilee color. We're going to stitch out the Fire Truck headlights. Switch to white. We're going to stitch out the window placement line on the truck. In the embellishment kit, we have this kind of plasticky thing. It's permanent topping. One side is textured, one side is smooth. I'm going to place it smooth side up. I've never used this before. We'll go ahead and place that. It says to place the window's permanent topping, stitch the window fill, and then tear away the extra. I'm going to put some tape on there and make sure that it's nice and secure. And we'll go ahead and stitch the window fill. Let's see if this tears away. It says to just tear it away. Oh, yeah, easily. Except for the piece in the middle. Let's see if I can get that going this direction. Haha! Almost. Might have to get some tweezers to get out that centerpiece. I've got that pretty well cleaned up. I had to get in there with my snips. It says to use the clear vinyl. We're going to cover what we just stitched out. So we'll go ahead and put that there, tape it into place, and tack it down and then trim. This vinyl is a bigger piece. It's got kind of a green tint to it. That's the one they have for the windows up here. I'm still not putting that on there. So the clear vinyl goes here for the windows on the truck. I've got that trimmed. That looks good on the fire truck. I do like it there. We're going to switch to the color black and stitch out the words fire station. Switch to white and stitch out the white star and firework explosions detail. We have two more steps. We have red star details and then the fairy light eyelets. I'm going to use my brighter red this time for the star details, and then I'll use the navy again to stitch out those eyelets. We're all done stitching. There's some jump threads here, a couple up here, and then on the block we started with, there's some jump threads in the fireworks. I need to trim all the jump threads, then we'll head over to the table and we'll trim our blocks. We need to trim both of our blocks. For the welcome block, I want to measure the space that's right here. We're going to sew this together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have this ruler here. It's a Creative Grids ruler. This section right here is 1/4 inch. If I line this up right on the edge, the stitching line is right here, the 1/4 inch hits right under the tree. When I look at the pictures in the instructions, it shows the bottom being right here where the bicycle is. I want this to be the bottom. So I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch right along the bottom of those bicycle tires, and then I'm going to look and see where the top ends up. The top ends up there where my finger is. I'm going to pull that away. Gosh, that's probably 1/8 of an inch away from that stitching. I'm okay to make this adjustment. I want to make this line up correctly so it looks good in the pillow. Here's a picture right here. See how the bicycle is sitting right there on the border? I'm going to go ahead and do my first cut to make sure that this will be at the 1/4 inch. So I'm going to use this ruler. It's got that nice 1/4 inch. Line that up underneath the bike tires. And then I need to find the stitching right here. I'm going to put this white line on that stitching. I want to make sure that I'm doing this straight. I'm going to line up 2 parts. And this is going to be 8.5 inches. So I'm going to trim up this side here. And I'm actually going to walk around my table and trim this side. I didn't put the rotating cutting mat down. I haven't moved the ruler, so I know this is going to be 8.5 inches. That's trimmed up very nice. I'm glad that worked out. I was a little worried about that. This needs to be 4.5 inches. I've got a straight line along the bottom. I'm going to line that up. I'm going to find that trimming line right there. And then I'm just going to pull this down just to double check. Make sure we're at there. We're at 4.5 like that. I'm going to slide this up. This is straight here. I'm going to go ahead and cut right here. And then we'll turn it and I'll measure 4.5. Make sure that I get the measurements correct on that. 4.5. Nice and straight here. And you've got a line here. And then you can always feel at the top. That looks good. Let's go ahead and trim that. Now I've got my 1/4 inch at the bottom, so when I sew this in, my bicycle is going to be sitting on the border. You can see the stitching right here. This is going to disappear in the seam allowance. Let's go on to the next one. For the fire station, I am going to use my rotating cutting mat and an orange pop ruler because it's the right size for the 6.5, 8.5. I still need to look here and check. I think I've got a little bit more than 1/4 inch. I think I'll need to make that slight adjustment. Yeah, just a little bit, the tiniest bit. There are marks on this ruler, and I think this mark here is 1/4 inch. It is. A real easy way to do this is to put this ruler right here on the orange pop ruler so the edges are touching. I can see my 1/4 inch. There we go. And the reason I'm doing that is because I used the background quilting and it didn't quite match exactly. Their newer products match exactly with the background quilting, so you don't have to do that. Double check that because when I picked it up, I bumped it. Of course, I'm going to take the next size up, put that on the outside. I'm going to hold this in place. I don't want that to slide. I'm going to grab my clip tin. If you've watched any of my videos before, I like to use the clip tin. It's kind of like a paperweight. If you've never used orange pop rulers before, we'll take an extra minute to go over these. There's a notch here and a notch here. Right-handed people are going to trim on the inner left side. Left-handed, you trim on the inner right side. You trim on the inside. You take your rotary blade, put it in a notch. It's got to go all the way over. There's a little bit of wiggle room. Make sure it's all the way over to the side and trim notch to notch. Watch your hand. Don't have your hand like this. Make sure all your fingers are out of the way. In fact, my hand's going to need to move. And we're going to go up to the top. I'm going to close my cutter, rotate my cutting mat, put my hand back on it so it doesn't move, move my little clip tin, and trim the next side. Just like the other one, I can actually see that trimming line, but I made the adjustment to make sure that I get the right seam allowance so when I sew this together, nothing is floating on the border. This will easily get caught in the seam allowance when we put the pillow together. If you don't want to make an adjustment like that and you've centered your block over your quilting and you have the same issue, when you sew it together, instead of a 1/4 inch seam allowance, take like, I don't know, 3/8 of an inch. It won't be a 1/2 inch. It'll be between a 1/2 inch and a 1/4 of an inch. That's all trimmed. Both our blocks do have embellishments. We'll add those at the end. Here's both of our blocks. They look great. Next week we'll stitch out the general store and the truck blocks. There's a link below to download your free schedule. I am trying to get new videos posted by Thursday. If there are any changes, I'll post it on my Facebook group. That's also linked below, or in the YouTube community tab post section on my YouTube channel. Please be sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends. If you're considering joining in and purchasing the Main Street Celebration bench pillow or any of your other Kimberbell needs after watching one of my videos, I ask that you please consider using the links below. I get a small commission, but more important, it lets Kimberbell know people are watching and enjoying my content. Thank you for making these blocks with me today. I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.